News of the Times. The Servant Who Shocked London. Sarah Malcolm's Fatal Crime. Welcome to News of the Times. In today's episode, we step into the shadowy corners of Georgian London, a city flickering with candlelight and rumour. The year is 1733. A laundress, a locked door, and 3 bodies brutally slain. From the hallowed halls of the Inner Temple to the gallows at Tyburn, the tale of Sarah Malcolm captured the imagination of a scandal-hungry public and the brush of William Hogarth himself. Was she a heartless killer in a mob cap and apron, or a desperate woman ensnared by class, circumstance, and suspicion? As her trial unfolds, so does the Georgian appetite for intrigue, poisonings, betrayals, blood-stained linens, and of course, a final pose for posterity. Join us as we delve into the courtroom spectacle, the public fury, and the printed outrage of the day. This is the case of Sarah Malcolm, one of Georgian London's most notorious murderesses. And in today's further particulars, what do you get when you mix a jolly seamstress, a nervous country gent, a proctor with paperwork, and a tavern full of dashed expectations? A near marriage made in haste and unmade even faster. In a tale where the bride was braver than the groom, vows were nearly exchanged until the mention of 8 children sent the gent running and the ladies fuming. It's Georgian romance at its most chaotic, and a reminder that cold feet are nothing new. Now, if all this sounds more thrilling than a surprise proposal at a tavern with no exit strategy, then do consider liking, subscribing, and possibly sharing this with that one friend who still believes 8 children is just the beginning of a good conversation. Every click, every share, and every side-eyed from a startled seamstress helps us battle the mysterious whims of the YouTube algorithm, a creature with more mood swings than a Regency suitor on market day. So, pop the kettle on, settle your nerves or your marriage prospects, and join us as we lift the veil on history's scandals, shadows, and short-lived courtships. And now, dear seekers of the strange and true, on with the show. Background. About Sarah Malcolm, born in 1710 or possibly 1711 in County Durham. Sarah Malcolm came from Anglo-Irish stock, a family once of some respectability, but like many stories of the era, hers begins with a downturn in fortune. Her father's extravagance is said to have drained the family's resources, and Sarah found herself turning to domestic service to earn her keep. She spent a brief spell in Dublin before returning to London, where she found work as a laundress, servicing chambers in the venerable Inns of Court, rooms typically let to wealthy lawyers and members of the legal profession. It was honest work, but poorly paid, and she was often in and out of low lodgings and rough company. In time, Sarah's path crossed with others of less scrupulous character, including a man named James Alexander, a romantic interest with a dubious moral compass, and his brother. The 3, along with a woman named Martha Tracy, were rumoured to have formed a kind of criminal circle. Whether driven by desperation, manipulation, or opportunity, Sarah found herself at the centre of a crime that shocked Georgian London. It is worth remembering that, at the time, female killers, especially those of apparent charm or youth, were an unsettling curiosity to the public. The idea of a woman involved in a multiple murder sent ripples through polite society and the press of the day eagerly descended. Sarah Malcolm may have been young, but the crime that bore her name was anything but small. It was February 1733 when London woke to news that would send whispers through drawing rooms and coffee houses alike. Three women, a wealthy widow and her two servants, were found murdered in their Temple chambers. The scene was grim, bloodied sheets, a ransacked room, and silence from those who had once filled it. The victims were Lydia Duncombe, reportedly strangled in her bed, Elizabeth Harrison, also believed strangled, and 17-year-old Anne Price, whose throat had been slit so violently that little doubt remained about the brutality involved. What made the crime especially shocking wasn't just the bodies. It was the accused, a laundress, a woman, and not just any woman, but one who had previously worked in the very rooms where the murders took place. Sarah claimed she was only the lookout, waiting nervously on the stairs while others, two men and a woman, did the bloody work. But when the dust settled, she was the only one arrested. More than £300 was stolen that night, a staggering sum in 1733, equal to around 65,000 or 70,000 pounds today, depending on the measure used. Coins, silver, a tankard still bearing traces of blood, all were traced back to Sarah's lodgings. Now, whether she was a calculating killer or a frightened accomplice, the public had already made up its mind, and now, so would the courts. From the Newgate calendar, the 7th of March, 1733, Sarah Malcolm, executed for the murder of a wealthy old lady in the Inns of Court on the 7th of March, 1733. This unhappy young woman, who at the period of her death was only 22 years of age, was born of respectable parents in the county of Durham in the year 1711, but her father having, through his extravagance, spent the whole of the property which he possessed, she was at length compelled to resort to what is commonly called servitude for the means of subsistence. In this condition for several years, she conducted herself extremely well, but at length, being employed at the Black Horse, a low public house in Boswell Court near Temple Bar, which had been constantly the notorious resort of persons of bad character, she formed connections of no very creditable classes, by whom she was led on to her ruin. Having at length quitted the Black Horse, she was recommended as a laundress to take charge of chambers in the Inns of Court, and amongst those for whom she there worked was a Mrs. Lydia Duncombe, a lady nearly 80 years of age, who occupied a set of chambers in the Temple. Elizabeth Harrison, aged 60, and Anne Price, aged 17, living with her in the capacity of servants. This lady being reputed to be very rich, a scheme was formed by Sarah Malcolm of robbing her chambers, her object being, it was supposed, by the acquisition of wealth to make herself a fitting match for a young man named Alexander, who she hoped would marry her. The night of Saturday the 3rd of February 1733 was fixed upon her for the commission of the robbery, and Martha Tracy, a woman of light character, her paramour Alexander, and his brother were to be her assistants in the execution of the project. Malcolm, by means of her acquaintance with the chambers, obtained possession of the keys of the outer door in the course of the day, and at night the robbery was effected, but with it the murder of also of Mrs. Duncombe and her servants Harrison and Price. On the Sunday morning some surprise was excited on it being observed that none of Mrs. Duncombe's family was to be seen, and at length, as the day advanced, great alarm was exhibited, and suspicions were entertained that all was not right. Mrs. Love, Mrs. Rymer, and Mrs. Oliphant, friends of Mrs. Duncombe, assembled in the afternoon at the door of her chambers, in obedience to an invitation which they had received to dinner, but being unable to gain admittance by knocking, they at length determined to force an entrance. One of the windows was resorted to for this purpose, to which access was obtained from a neighbouring set of chambers, and then, on Mrs. Oliphant going into Mrs. Duncombe's bedroom, the old lady was found there strangled, while her servant Harrison was discovered in an adjoining apartment also strangled, and the girl Price was seen lying on her bed with her throat cut from ear to ear. The news of this diabolical crime soon became published through the neighbourhood, and on the chambers of the deceased being examined, it was found that they had been stripped of all the valuables which could be easily carried away, consisting of money, silver, and plate, and other articles of a similar description. In the course of the day, some circumstances transpired tending to fix the suspicions of the police upon the woman Malcolm, and, upon her lodgings being searched, a silver tankard, the handle of which was covered with blood, was found concealed in a closet. She was in consequence taken into custody, and having undergone an examination on the following day before the magistrate, she was committed to Newgate. Upon her entering the jail, she was searched by Johnson, one of the turnkeys, who took from her a considerable sum of money in gold and silver coin, and she admitted to him that it was Mrs. Duncombe's. But, added she, I'll make you a present of it if you will say nothing of the matter. The jailer took possession of the money, but produced it to his superior officers, acquainting with them with the conversation which had passed. In the course of the subsequent imprisonment of the unhappy woman, she frequently conversed with Johnson upon the subject of the murder, and admitted that she had arranged the robbery, although she declared that she had had nothing to do with putting Mrs. Duncombe and her servants to death. She asserted that 2 men and a woman were concerned with her, and that she watched on the stairs while they entered the chambers. At her trial, when called on for her defence, she made a similar declaration, and stated that Tracy and the 2 Alexanders were her companions, but still persisted in her allegation of her ignorance of the murder until it was discovered by Mrs. Oliphant on the day after it was committed. A verdict of guilty was, however, returned, and the wretched woman was ordered for execution. After her conviction, she evinced the most sincere penitence, but still persisted in her refusal to confess herself guilty of the whole crime with which she was charged. Upon the bellman coming into her in the customary manner, she attended anxiously to what he said, and at the conclusion of his address, she threw him a shilling to buy wine. On the morning of the execution, the 7th of March, 1733, she appeared more composed than she had been for some time, and she seemed to join in prayers with the ordinary and another gentleman who attended, with much sincerity. When in the cart, she wrung her hands and wept most bitterly. At the place of execution, near Fetter Lane, she behaved with the utmost devoutness and resigned to the divine will, but when the ordinary in his prayers recommended her soul to God, she fainted, and with much difficulty recovered her senses. On the cart driven off, she turned towards the temple, and crying out, "Oh, my mistress, I wish I could see her," and then, casting her eyes towards heaven, called upon Christ to receive her soul. Details of her execution were recounted in the Ipswich Journal. From the Ipswich Journal on the 8th of March, 1733, yesterday, Sarah Malcolm was executed on a gibbet erected over against Mitre Court in Fleet Street, in sight of a great number of spectators, as the street, balconies and houses and scaffolds purportedly erected can contain. There was the largest crowd that had been known in the memory of man. Her behaviour was decent and seemingly very penitent, but just before she was turned off, she delivered a paper written with her own hand to the Reverend Mr. Pidlington of Little St. Bartholomew's, which she said contained something that was necessary for her to acquaint the world with, and she desired that as the same had been sealed up in Newgate in the presence of several gentlemen, it might also be opened before them and the sheriffs. She received the sacrament in the morning, and declared at the place of execution that she died a Protestant. She was very desirous to see her master, Mr. Connolly, and looked about for him, whom she acquitted of all manner of aspersions or imputations laid on him at her trial, but confessed nothing concerning the murders. After she had talked some time with the ministers, as she was going to be turned off, she fainted away, and it was some time before she was brought to her senses. But being afterwards recovered, Jack Ketch kissed her, and another fellow attempted the same. Would she refused, she was then turned off. About half an hour after, she was cut down and her body carried back to Newgate under a strong guard of the mob. Several of the nobility and other persons of distinction saw the execution from the neighbouring houses, and very few of the ladies and gentlemen had their pockets either picked or cut off. Her said confession was opened this afternoon, but the two societies of the Temple, desiring to see it before it was printed, now have it in their hands, but are to send it back to the sheriffs this night. Last Monday, the said Sarah Malcolm sat for her picture in Newgate, which was taken by the ingenious Mr. Hogarth. Postscript. And what of those that Sarah named, Martha Tracy and the two Alexander brothers? Curiously, despite Sarah's repeated claims that she was only the lookout while her co-conspirators did the bloody work, the others were never brought to trial. Authorities seemed content that the key suspect was in custody, and perhaps, in the eyes of the court, a laundress with a confession of sorts was easier to convict than pursuing shadowy accomplices who had vanished into the fog of London. There are scattered reports that James Alexander may have fled abroad, while others say he melted quietly into the London underground. Martha Tracy, describes as a woman of light character, was questioned but never charged. Whether due to lack of evidence or lack of will, no further arrests were made, and Sarah alone bore the weight of the gallows. Her conviction, as well as the lurid spectacle that followed, satisfied the justice of the day, but as with so many historical cases, the question of who truly committed what remains forever just out of reach. Sarah Malcolm's strange immortality. Although Sarah Malcolm met her end at Tyburn, her story refused to die with her. Just days before her execution, she sat calm and composed for a portrait in her Newgate cell. The artist was none other than William Hogarth, already a name of growing repute. He was fascinated not just by Sarah's crime, but by her bearing, clear-eyed, unfaltering, and eerily still for a woman on the brink of death. Her portrait, unflinching and sober, was no caricature. It was a statement, and it became one of Hogarth's most talked about works, studied and circulated as both social commentary and morbid souvenir. In that image, Sarah Malcolm lived on, part criminal, part curiosity, and forever staring calmly back at a world that had already judged her. Even centuries later, her face hangs in collections, her crime still whispered about, proof that some stories, like some stairs, are impossible to shake. Further particular, after murder, mayhem, and moral panic, we arrive, gratefully, at a tale of matrimonial mishap. No bloodstains here, just blushes and buyer's remorse, the kind of romantic chaos only Georgian taverns could brew. It begins, as many such tales do, in a tavern, and a hopeful seamstress, a dithering country gentleman, and a proctor with paperwork, and you've got the makings of a marriage, or at least a mildly awkward social occasion. Promises are made, doubts are raised, and 8 children are confessed, all before the wine's gone warm. Let us now raise an eyebrow and perhaps a tankard to the art of last-minute second thoughts. From the Caledonian Mercury, July 1728. A week or two ago, a proctor was sent to a tavern in the Commons by a substantial-looking country man and a jolly handsome seamstress about a licence for them. But it seemed the bargain was not quite finished, being struck only at an accidental meeting at her house upon a question of gallantry often put to the ladies. She freely accepted him for a careless husband. The time present agreed on, he cries, "Hang the party that flinches." She replied, "The devil takes the flincher." A coach bringing them with her maid to the Commons, but when it came to the point both their resolutions did not hold. The man asked her if it required not more consideration, and gave her to understand he had 8 children. But that not lessening her regard for her word past, or desire for a husband, he flatly declined it. And so the proctor and madam with her maid took their leaves, severely reproaching him for the disappointment, and he stayed behind to pay the reckoning, well satisfied that he was not undertook to do more than he was able. 'Tis observable from the whole that the woman nowadays exceeds the men, both in courage and keeping their promises. And that concludes today's episode, featuring bloodstained tankards, questionable marriage proposals, and one laundress whose idea of a clean sheet was, well, rather more literal than we'd like. From the gallows at Fleet Street to a tavern proposal turned tactical retreat, it's safe to say Georgian London knew how to keep us all entertained, preferably from a safe distance and behind a sturdy wig. If you're enjoying this dash through dark deeds and dashed expectations, do consider liking, subscribing, and sharing. It helps more than a well-placed tankard in a laundress's closet, and unlike poor Sarah Malcolm, you don't have to face a mob of onlookers to do it. And if you'd like to dive deeper into history's shadows and enjoy ad-free episodes, daily uploads, and over 600 historical crime documentaries, plus the occasional cameo from Aunt Edna and Colin's Cravat, then head over to our Patreon, or stop by our Ko-fi blog, where the teapot is always brewing and the mysteries are always mildly suspicious. You've been listening to News of the Times, and I'm Robin Coles, purveyor of Victorian villainy and Georgian gossip. Until next time, keep your tankard polished, your proposals sincere, and your secrets strictly postscript.